The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Margaret Thornfield, a wealthy businesswoman from Manchester who had paid extra for a premium palace tour. Her expensive clothes and sharp demeanor set her apart from the other visitors who waited patiently behind the golden ropes. Margaret checked her diamond watch repeatedly, growing more irritated with each passing minute. She had important meetings later that day and expected everything to run exactly on schedule. The tour guide, a cheerful young woman named Sarah, was explaining the history of the palace's east wing when Margaret interrupted loudly. "Excuse me, but we were supposed to start this tour 15 minutes ago," Margaret snapped, her voice carrying across the ornate entrance hall. Other tourists turned to look, some with sympathy, others with annoyance at the disruption. Sarah maintained her professional smile despite the embarrassment. "I apologize for the slight delay, madam. We're just waiting for one more family to join us, and then we'll begin immediately." The family in question was the Johnsons from Birmingham, Robert and Linda Johnson with their 8-year-old son Timothy. They had saved for 2 years to afford this special palace tour as Timothy's birthday present. The boy had been fascinated by royal history since he could read, and his bedroom walls were covered with pictures of castles and knights. Timothy bounced excitedly beside his parents, clutching a small notebook where he planned to write down everything he learned. His enthusiasm was infectious, and several other tourists smiled, watching him point out details he recognized from his history books. He wore his best clothes, a navy blazer his grandmother had bought him specifically for this special day. When the Johnsons finally arrived, slightly out of breath from rushing through London traffic, Timothy immediately began asking Sarah questions about the paintings on the walls. His genuine curiosity and politeness charmed everyone except Margaret, who rolled her eyes and tapped her foot impatiently. "Finally," Margaret muttered under her breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Some people have no consideration for others' time. The tour began with Sarah leading the group through the staterooms, explaining the significance of each chamber and the priceless artwork adorning the walls. Timothy listened intently, occasionally raising his hand to ask thoughtful questions that impressed even the adults in the group. As they moved through the palace, Margaret's frustration seemed to grow rather than diminish. She complained about the pace, criticized the explanations as too detailed, and made several sarcastic comments about amateur tourists who didn't understand proper etiquette. The group's dynamic was becoming increasingly tense. While most visitors tried to ignore Margaret's behavior, her constant complaints were beginning to affect everyone's enjoyment of what should have been a magical experience. Timothy, however, remained blissfully unaware of the adult drama unfolding around him, too captivated by the royal treasures to notice anything else. During a stop in the throne room, Timothy asked Sarah if he could take a photo of the ornate ceiling. As he stepped back to get a better angle, he accidentally bumped into Margaret, who was checking her phone for messages. The contact was minimal, barely a brush against her designer handbag, but Margaret's reaction was explosive. "Watch where you're going, you little brat," she shouted, her face flushing red with anger. The harsh words echoed off the throne room's high ceilings, causing every head in the tour group to turn in shock. Timothy's parents immediately stepped forward to apologize, but Margaret wasn't finished. Her morning of accumulated frustrations had found a target, and she seemed determined to make the child pay for every inconvenience she had experienced. The other tourists watched in growing discomfort as an adult woman prepared to unleash her full fury on an 8-year-old boy whose only crime was being excited about history. The palace walls, which had witnessed centuries of royal drama, were about to see a very different kind of confrontation unfold. Margaret's voice grew louder and more aggressive as she towered over Timothy, who had shrunk back against his mother's side. The boy's eyes filled with tears, not from any physical pain, but from the shock of being yelled at so harshly by a complete stranger. His parents, Robert and Linda, stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond to such unexpected hostility. "Children these days have no manners," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with contempt. "Running around like wild animals in a place of such importance. Where is your discipline?" Sarah, the tour guide, stepped forward diplomatically. "Perhaps we could all take a deep breath and continue with our tour," she suggested, hoping to diffuse the situation before it escalated further. But Margaret was beyond reason. The stress of her business dealings, combined with her natural sense of entitlement, had created a perfect storm of anger. She pointed an accusatory finger at Timothy, who was now openly crying. "This is exactly what's wrong with society today," she declared to anyone who would listen. "Parents who can't control their children, letting them run wild in places they don't belong." Robert Johnson finally found his voice. "Now wait just a minute," he said, his own anger beginning to rise. "My son did nothing wrong. He barely touched you, and he apologized immediately." "Don't you dare defend this behavior," Margaret shot back. "That child needs to learn respect, and if you won't teach him, maybe someone else should." The threat in her words was unmistakable. Several tourists shifted uncomfortably, looking around for someone in authority to intervene. The situation was spiraling out of control in one of the most famous buildings in Britain, and nobody seemed to know how to stop it. Timothy's sobs grew louder, and Linda Johnson wrapped her arms protectively around her son. The little boy who had been so excited about seeing the palace was now trembling with fear and confusion. His special birthday treat was turning into a nightmare. "Please, ma'am," Linda said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's just a child. He didn't mean any harm." Margaret's response was swift and shocking. Without warning, she raised her hand and delivered a sharp slap across Timothy's cheek. The sound echoed through the throne room like a gunshot, followed by a moment of absolute silence. The other tourists gasped in horror. Sarah dropped her clipboard, her professional composure finally cracking. Robert Johnson's face went white with rage, while Linda pulled Timothy closer, checking his reddened cheek with shaking hands. "How dare you?" Robert shouted, stepping toward Margaret. "How dare you lay a hand on my child?" Margaret showed no remorse. If anything, she seemed satisfied with her action. "Maybe now he'll learn some respect," she said coldly. But what Margaret didn't know was that their confrontation had attracted more than just the attention of the tour group. Palace security cameras had captured the entire incident, and 2 royal guards who had been monitoring the tour from a discreet distance had witnessed the assault. Sergeant James Mitchell, a decorated military veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Royal Guard, had seen enough. He had watched Margaret's behavior escalate throughout the morning, hoping she would calm down without intervention. But striking a child crossed every line he held sacred. His partner, Guardsman David Ashworth, was newer to the force but equally appalled by what they had witnessed. Both men had children of their own, and understood that their duty to protect extended to every innocent person within the palace walls. The guards exchanged a meaningful look. They had protocols to follow, but they also had consciences that wouldn't allow them to stand by while a child was abused. Margaret Thornfield was about to discover that money and attitude meant nothing when faced with the unwavering principles of the Royal Guard. As Timothy's cries echoed through the ornate chamber, Sergeant Mitchell made a decision that would change the course of everyone's day. He stepped out of the shadows, his polished boots clicking authoritatively on the marble floor, ready to make a stand that would remind everyone present that some lines should never be crossed. Sergeant James Mitchell's imposing figure appeared as if from nowhere, his red tunic and tall black bearskin hat commanding immediate attention from everyone in the throne room. The 34-year-old guard had been protecting the royal family for 6 years, but he had never faced a situation quite like this one. "Excuse me, madam," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I need you to step away from the child immediately." Margaret turned to face him, her expression showing more annoyance than concern. She was clearly used to dealing with what she considered staff and expected the guard to support her position as a paying customer. "Finally, someone with authority," she said dismissively. "I want this family removed from the tour immediately. That child is completely out of control and actually assaulted me." Mitchell's jaw tightened as he looked down at Timothy, who was still crying softly while his mother held him. The red mark on the boy's cheek was clearly visible, and the guard's military training had taught him to assess situations quickly and accurately. "Ma'am, I witnessed the entire incident," Mitchell replied calmly. "What I saw was you striking a child who accidentally bumped into you. That constitutes assault under British law." Margaret's confidence faltered for the first time. She had expected support, not confrontation. "Don't be ridiculous," she sputtered. "I'm a paying customer here. I paid good money for this tour and I expect proper service." "Your payment gives you access to this tour," Mitchell responded firmly. "It does not give you the right to assault anyone, especially a child." Guardsman Ashworth had now joined his partner, and together the two men presented an intimidating wall of authority. The other tourists watched in fascination as the drama unfolded, many of them pulling out phones to record what was happening. Robert Johnson, still shaking with rage over the attack on his son, stepped forward. "Officer, I want to press charges against this woman. She had no right to hit my boy." "That's absolutely your right, sir," Mitchell replied, never taking his eyes off Margaret. "And I'll be happy to provide a witness statement about what I observed." Margaret's face grew pale as she began to realize the serious nature of her situation. "This is absurd," she protested. "I barely touched him. Children need discipline, and clearly his parents aren't providing it." "Ma'am," Mitchell said, his voice growing harder, "I have a 7-year-old daughter at home. If any adult ever laid a hand on her the way you just did to this boy, I would expect them to face the full consequences of their actions." Sarah, the tour guide, had finally recovered enough to radio for additional security. Her hands were still shaking as she spoke into her headset, requesting immediate assistance in the throne room. Linda Johnson had managed to calm Timothy somewhat, but the boy was still clinging to her and occasionally sniffling. The excitement in his eyes had been replaced by fear and confusion. His special birthday visit to the palace would forever be marked by this traumatic experience. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Margaret demanded, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is completely unacceptable treatment of a customer." "You'll have that opportunity shortly," Mitchell replied. "Palace security is on their way along with the Metropolitan Police. Assaulting a minor on royal property is taken very seriously indeed." The weight of Mitchell's words began to sink in. Margaret's anger was slowly being replaced by fear as she realized she might actually face legal consequences for her actions. She looked around the room, perhaps hoping for support from the other tourists, but found only disapproving stares. One elderly gentleman in the tour group spoke up. "Disgraceful behavior," he muttered. "Absolutely disgraceful." Another tourist, a mother with her own young children, pulled them closer and glared at Margaret with obvious contempt. The woman who had started the morning feeling superior to everyone around her now found herself completely isolated. Mitchell maintained his professional demeanor, but inside he was furious. His own childhood had been marked by poverty and difficulty, and he had joined the military partly to escape an unstable home life. The idea of an adult using their power to hurt a defenseless child struck at his very core. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the palace corridors, Margaret made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. But Sergeant Mitchell was prepared to ensure that justice would be served, regardless of Margaret's wealth or status. Within minutes, the throne room filled with additional palace security personnel and 2 Metropolitan Police officers. The lead officer, Constable Emma Rodriguez, had been called in specifically because of her expertise in dealing with cases involving children. Her presence added another layer of authority to the already tense situation. Margaret watched nervously as the officers surveyed the scene. She had hoped that once real police arrived, they would take her side against what she still considered an overreaction from the palace staff. Her confidence in her social status was about to receive another devastating blow. "Sergeant Mitchell," Constable Rodriguez said professionally, "can you walk me through what happened here?" Mitchell straightened to attention. "Yes, ma'am. I observed the entire incident from my position near the east entrance. The defendant verbally abused the child for several minutes before delivering what appeared to be a deliberate slap to his face." "That's not true," Margaret interrupted desperately. "I barely touched him. These people are making a mountain out of a molehill." Rodriguez turned her attention to Margaret with the practiced calm of an experienced officer. "Ma'am, I'll need you to remain quiet while I gather statements from all witnesses. You'll have your opportunity to tell your side of the story." Timothy had finally stopped crying, but he remained close to his parents, occasionally touching his still red cheek. Linda Johnson was gently explaining to him that the nice police officers were there to help, not to get him in trouble. "Can you tell me your name, sweetheart?" Rodriguez asked Timothy in a gentle voice, kneeling down to his eye level. "Timothy Johnson," the boy whispered. "I'm 8 years old. Today was supposed to be my birthday treat." The simple innocence of his words struck everyone present. Here was a child who had done nothing more than accidentally bump into someone while trying to take a photograph, and his special day had been ruined by an adult's uncontrolled anger. Rodriguez took detailed statements from Timothy's parents, Sarah, the tour guide, and several other tourists who had witnessed the incident. Each account corroborated Mitchell's version of events. Margaret had been increasingly aggressive throughout the morning, and her physical attack on Timothy was unprovoked and unjustified. During this process, Margaret's demeanor continued to deteriorate. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. She was facing potential criminal charges, her reputation would be destroyed, and her business relationships might suffer irreparable damage. "This is ridiculous," she said to anyone who would listen. "Don't you know who I am? I run a successful company. I employ dozens of people. I'm not some common criminal." Sergeant Mitchell stepped forward again. "Ma'am, with respect, it doesn't matter who you are or what you do for a living. What matters is what you did to that child." His words carried the weight of absolute moral authority. Mitchell had seen enough violence in his military service to recognize the difference between necessary force and bullying. What Margaret had done fell squarely into the latter category. Robert Johnson, who had been remarkably restrained given the circumstances, finally addressed Margaret directly. "My son saved his pocket money for months to buy a special notebook for this visit," he said quietly. "He's been planning this day since Christmas. You didn't just hit a child today. You destroyed something precious that we can never get back." The tour guide, Sarah, added her own perspective. "In 5 years of leading palace tours, I've never seen anyone behave so aggressively toward other guests, especially a child." As the statements were completed, Constable Rodriguez made her decision. "Margaret Thornfield, I'm placing you under arrest for assault on a minor. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." Margaret's face went white as the handcuffs were produced. "Wait," she pleaded desperately. "Can't we work something out? I'm willing to apologize. I'll pay for counseling for the child." But Sergeant Mitchell wasn't interested in convenient solutions that would sweep the incident under the carpet. "Some actions have consequences that money can't fix," he said firmly. As Margaret was led away by the police officers, she cast one final angry look at the Johnson family. Even in defeat, she seemed unable to accept responsibility for her actions or show genuine remorse for the pain she had caused. The remaining tourists watched in stunned silence as their morning tour took an unexpected turn into the realm of real-world justice. But for Sergeant Mitchell, this was exactly the kind of moment that reminded him why he had chosen to serve and protect others. After Margaret was escorted from the palace, an unusual quiet settled over the throne room. The other tourists stood in small groups, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Some were checking their phones, already sharing the story on social media. Others simply looked shocked that such an incident could occur in one of Britain's most prestigious locations. Sergeant Mitchell approached the Johnson family, removing his ceremonial hat in a gesture of respect. His formal military bearing softened as he knelt down to Timothy's level, just as Constable Rodriguez had done earlier. "Timothy," he said gently, "I want you to know that what happened to you today was not your fault. You did absolutely nothing wrong." The boy looked up at the imposing guard with wide eyes. "Are you really a soldier?" he asked quietly. Mitchell smiled, the first time his stern expression had relaxed all morning. "I was a soldier before I became a royal guard. Now my job is to protect special places like this palace, and that includes protecting visitors like you." Timothy's face brightened slightly. Despite the trauma of the morning, his fascination with military history was reasserting itself. "Did you fight in any wars?" "I served in Afghanistan," Mitchell replied honestly. "But you know what? The most important battle I fought today was right here in this room, standing up for what's right." Robert Johnson extended his hand to the sergeant. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for what you did, but for how you did it. You showed my son that there are good people in the world who will stand up for those who can't protect themselves." Linda Johnson wiped away tears that were now flowing from relief rather than distress. "We were so worried about bringing Timothy to London," she admitted. "We're just simple people from Birmingham. We saved for 2 years for this trip and we were afraid we wouldn't fit in." "Mrs. Johnson," Mitchell replied firmly, "your family showed more class and dignity today than that woman ever will. Regardless of how much money she has, Sarah." The tour guide had been quietly observing the interaction. She approached the group with a suggestion that would surprise everyone. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, if you're willing, I'd like to offer Timothy a private tour of some areas not normally included in our regular tours. Consider it our way of making sure his birthday ends on a positive note." Timothy's eyes lit up for the first time since the incident. "Really? Can we see where the knight's armor is kept?" "We can absolutely arrange that," Sarah confirmed, her professional enthusiasm returning. As arrangements were being made for the special tour, Guardsman Ashworth approached his partner. "So you should know that several tourists recorded the entire incident on their phones. The video is already starting to spread online." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "Good. Let people see what happened. Let them see that actions have consequences, regardless of someone's social status." What Mitchell didn't yet realize was that his intervention would indeed spread far beyond the palace walls. Within hours, videos of a royal guard standing up to a wealthy tourist who had struck a child would be viewed millions of times across social media platforms. The story would become a symbol of ordinary people standing up for what's right, regardless of the consequences. Meanwhile, at the local police station, Margaret Thornfield was discovering that her wealth and connections meant very little in the face of clear evidence and multiple witnesses. Her expensive lawyer was already on his way, but even he would struggle to defend against video evidence and the testimony of a decorated military veteran. Back at the palace, Timothy was getting his private tour, accompanied by his parents and personally guided by Sarah. Sergeant Mitchell had returned to his duties, but not before giving Timothy his business card and inviting the family to contact him if they ever visited London again. As they walked through the palace corridors, Timothy asked his father an important question. "Dad, why did that lady hit me?" "I didn't do anything bad, did I?" Robert Johnson thought carefully before answering. "No, son, you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes adults make very bad choices when they're angry or frustrated, but you also saw how good people like Sergeant Mitchell step in to help when someone is being treated unfairly." The lesson wasn't lost on Timothy. Even at 8 years old, he was beginning to understand that the world contained both people who would hurt others and people who would protect them. Today, he had encountered both types, and he would remember the difference for the rest of his life. 3 days after the incident at Buckingham Palace, the story had taken on a life of its own. Videos recorded by tourists had been shared millions of times across social media platforms, with hashtags like #Palace Justice and Guard Hero trending worldwide. News outlets from Britain to Australia were covering the story of a royal guard who stood up to a wealthy tourist who assaulted a child. Sergeant James Mitchell found himself at the center of a media storm he never wanted or expected. Reporters had gathered outside the palace gates hoping to interview the guard who had become an overnight symbol of standing up for what's right. Palace officials were fielding hundreds of interview requests from news organizations around the world. In Birmingham, the Johnson family was also dealing with unexpected attention. Their phone hadn't stopped ringing since their story became public. Robert Johnson had taken time off work to handle the media requests, while Linda tried to help Timothy understand why so many people were suddenly interested in their experience. "Mummy," Timothy asked as they watched a news report about the incident, "why are all these people talking about what happened to me?" Linda chose her words carefully. "Because, sweetheart, sometimes when something unfair happens to one person, it reminds everyone else about what's right and wrong. People are angry that someone hurt you, and they're happy that Sergeant Mitchell helped you." The public response had been overwhelmingly supportive of both the Johnson family and Sergeant Mitchell. Online fundraising campaigns had raised thousands of pounds for Timothy's education, while messages of support poured in from around the world. Parents shared their own stories of children being mistreated by adults, and many expressed gratitude that someone had finally stood up and said, "Enough." However, Margaret Thornfield was experiencing the other side of internet justice. Her business had been identified through public records, and angry customers were canceling contracts and posting negative reviews. Her company's website had crashed under the volume of traffic, much of it from people expressing their disgust with her behavior. Margaret's expensive legal team was working overtime to manage the crisis. They had advised her to stay completely out of public view while they attempted damage control. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and public opinion had already reached its verdict. At the palace, senior officials were meeting to discuss how to handle the unprecedented situation. The Royal Guard was not typically supposed to become the center of public attention, but Mitchell's actions had been so clearly correct that criticism would be impossible. Colonel William Hartwell, commander of the Palace Guard, called Mitchell into his office for a private conversation. "Sergeant, I want you to know that your actions 3 days ago reflected the very best traditions of our service. You upheld your duty to protect those who cannot protect themselves." "Thank you, sir," Mitchell replied. "I only did what any decent person should do in that situation." "That may be true," Hartwell continued, "but not every person would have had the courage to act. You've received commendations from the Metropolitan Police, letters of support from members of Parliament, and even a personal message from the Prime Minister's office." Mitchell was genuinely surprised by the extent of the support. "Sir, I never intended for this to become such a public matter. Sometimes, Sergeant, the right action at the right moment captures the public imagination in ways we can't predict or control. Your intervention has become a symbol of something much larger than a single incident." Meanwhile, Constable Rodriguez was preparing her case against Margaret Thornfield. The evidence was so strong that she expected a quick plea bargain, but Margaret's lawyers were still pushing for the charges to be dropped. They argued that the incident had been blown out of proportion and that their client had already suffered enough through public humiliation. Rodriguez wasn't buying it. "This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment," she told her supervisor. "The witnesses describe a pattern of escalating aggressive behavior throughout the morning. She targeted a child because she thought she could get away with it." The case had also caught the attention of child protection advocates, who saw it as an opportunity to highlight the issue of adult violence against children. They were pushing for the maximum possible penalty to send a message that such behavior would not be tolerated, regardless of the perpetrator's social status. Back in Birmingham, Timothy was slowly returning to his normal routine, though his parents noticed he was more cautious around strangers than before. The incident had affected him more deeply than he initially let on, but he was also proud that his story had inspired so many people to speak out against bullying. As the week progressed, it became clear that this incident would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. Margaret Thornfield's reputation and business were in ruins, while Sergeant Mitchell had become an unlikely hero. But most importantly, Timothy Johnson had learned that even when bad things happen, there are always good people willing to stand up and help. 6 months after the incident that shocked the nation, the courtroom was packed with journalists and members of the public who had followed Margaret Thornfield's case through every stage of the legal process. Her trial had become a symbol of accountability, regardless of wealth or social status. Margaret sat at the defendant's table, looking nothing like the confident businesswoman who had strutted through Buckingham Palace that morning. The months of public scrutiny, legal battles, and business losses had taken their toll. Her company had collapsed under the weight of canceled contracts and negative publicity. Several employees had lost their jobs as a direct result of her actions. Judge Patricia Whitmore had presided over many assault cases in her 20-year career, but few had attracted such intense public interest. The video evidence was clear and undeniable, showing Margaret's escalating aggression culminating in her striking 8-year-old Timothy Johnson. "Ms. Thornfield," Judge Whitmore said sternly, "your actions on that morning at Buckingham Palace were inexcusable. You assaulted a defenseless child in one of our nation's most revered locations. The evidence shows a pattern of aggressive behavior that culminated in an act of violence against someone who could not defend himself." Margaret's lawyer had tried every possible defense, but the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, including a decorated military veteran, had testified about what they observed. The video footage left no room for alternative interpretations. Timothy Johnson, now 9 years old, had given his testimony via video link to avoid further trauma. He had grown more confident since the incident, partly due to the counseling his family had received with funds donated by strangers who were moved by his story. Sergeant James Mitchell was present in the courtroom, though he had tried to avoid the publicity surrounding the trial. His intervention that morning had changed his life in ways he never expected. He had received commendations from multiple organizations and had been promoted within the Palace Guard. More importantly, he had become a role model for standing up against injustice. The court sentences Margaret Thornfield to 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, 200 hours of community service specifically working with children's charities, and a fine of $5,000 to be paid to organizations supporting child welfare, Judge Whitmore announced. The suspended sentence meant Margaret would avoid prison unless she committed another offense, but the community service would force her to confront the consequences of her actions by working with the very demographic she had attacked. Outside the courthouse, Robert Johnson spoke to the gathered media. "This has never been about revenge," he said. "It's been about justice and making sure that no other child has to go through what Timothy experienced. We hope this sends a message that adults who abuse their power over children will be held accountable." Sergeant Mitchell, despite his reluctance to speak publicly, also addressed the media. "I want people to understand that what happened that day wasn't heroic. It was simply the right thing to do. Every adult has a responsibility to protect children from harm, whether they're wearing a uniform or not." The incident had sparked broader conversations about adult behavior toward children in public spaces. Several organizations had launched campaigns promoting respect and kindness, using Timothy's story as an example of why intervention matters when children are being mistreated. Timothy himself had become something of a celebrity, though his parents worked hard to keep his life as normal as possible. He still loved history and had returned to the palace twice more, both times receiving special tours from staff who remembered his story. His confidence had returned, and he spoke passionately about wanting to become a historian when he grew up. Margaret Thornfield began her community service at a children's center in Manchester, where she worked under close supervision helping with after-school programs. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the woman who had struck a child was now required to help other children as part of her punishment. The manager of the center, Sarah Williams, was initially skeptical about accepting Margaret as a volunteer. "We're giving her a chance to make amends," Williams explained, "but she'll be watched carefully. Children's safety is our top priority." As Margaret started her community service, she was forced to confront the reality of what she had done. Working with children day after day, she began to see them as individuals rather than obstacles to her comfort. The transformation was slow and sometimes painful, but it was necessary. The palace tour guide, Sarah, had been promoted to senior tour coordinator, partly because of her professional handling of the crisis. She often told new guides about the importance of protecting all visitors, especially children, and ensuring that everyone felt welcome and safe. The incident at Buckingham Palace had created ripple effects that extended far beyond those directly involved. It had reminded people that standing up for what's right sometimes requires courage, but it's always worth doing. For Timothy Johnson, it had shown him that even when bad things happen, there are good people ready to help. For Sergeant Mitchell, it had confirmed that his choice to serve and protect others was the right path. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that in a world where wealth and status often seem to matter more than character, justice can still prevail when ordinary people decide to do extraordinary things.